So, Greg, when you think about raw egg consumption, what comes to mind?
Man, so two things come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is Rocky 1. Second thing that comes to mind is when I started getting into lifting, my parents initially were just like just completely against the use of protein powder or supplements in any form. So kind of V1 of this before the raw eggs come in is instead of letting me drink protein shakes, just like buy some powder, mix it up, whatever, they would only let me, well, not let me buy, they would buy these for me, I think to make sure I wasn't like buying protein behind their back. But they would buy me Ensure drinks, like the stuff for like people who can't chew or digest food well. Man, those are fucking rough. They have the consistency of sweetened condensed milk. Like they're unbelievably viscous, and they also don't have that much protein. I think it was like 15 grams per can or something like that.
Yeah. They're like a protein supplement for someone with no athletic related goals, right? It's just like getting enough protein to be a healthy adult.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so, like trying to chug 2 of those after a workout was just miserable.
Yeah.
So eventually they relented a little bit and said, okay, you can get a basic protein supplement, but initially they limited me, I think, to just 1 scoop a day. And they certainly wouldn't let me touch mass gainers. But, I was, at this point, just getting into powerlifting. I think I was like maybe 160, 170. And I've mentioned this on the podcast before. Like my first training crew were all guys who were very strong, untested multiply lifters who had some, in hindsight, unhelpful ideas about how much people should weigh at particular heights. So, for them, it's like, oh, you're like 5'10", you need to at least be a 242, probably a 275. That probably wasn't a great idea to get lodged in my brain that young, but it did. And so I was like, dude, like I need to gain weight, and I'm training all the time, still playing sports, very active. So if you can believe it, at one point in my life, I did actually have some struggle with putting on weight just because my activity level was so high. And since I couldn't use mass gainers, I had to come up with my own that in hindsight was far worse and just like more inherently dangerous than just buying a mass gainer would be. But every morning I would mix myself up a mass gainer shake where most of the protein just had to come from raw eggs because like I couldn't use that much protein powder. So it would be whole milk, ice cream, peanut butter, like a scoop or 2 of protein powder, and then like a dozen raw eggs. And I just throw it in the blender, mix it up.
A dozen?
Maybe it was like 8. It was at least 6. It was a good number of raw eggs, which I'll note, like, so eggs kind of like have a weird smell and taste, mostly from like the sulfurous compounds in the yolk, but those don't go volatile and really like affect the smell or taste that much until they're cooked. So drinking raw eggs is not as unpleasant as one would assume, especially if you got some ice cream and peanut butter in the mix. But anyway, I'd mix that shake up, pour it into a 1/2-gallon bottle, and just drink on it from the morning until about 4 p.m. that day.
Oh my God, that's disgusting.
Which is, again, like that. So in terms of food safety, very bad idea. In terms of like the bacteria I was ingesting, probably very gross. On a purely hedonic, just like gustatory basis, it was fine. Like it tasted okay, and the taste didn't get meaningfully worse throughout the day. But anyway, in hindsight, it is very funny that they were totally fine with me consuming like a dozen room temperature raw eggs every day, but wouldn't let me use a mass gainer. But anyway, so that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think raw eggs. Just I used to consume a lot of them in a very dangerous way.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Rocky Balboa movie franchise, and
That's why they were fine with me drinking the raw eggs. Like my father loves the Rocky movie franchise, and he's like, look, man, like sliced alone wouldn't lead people astray. if he's willing to put himself on the silver screen drinking raw eggs, they've got to be safe for my boy.
Yeah.
Like I think that was kind of the thought process.
Well, not just safe, but also effective and hardcore.
Correct.
Right? So like when someone says like, hey, you know, I'm taking my lifting really seriously, I'm going to have an omelet for breakfast. You just say, well, an omelet is just a lovely breakfast. That's not very hardcore.
Yeah.
But if you say, I'm going to crack 4 eggs into a glass with nothing else and chug it, people are like, oh shit, you really want to get big.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of that comes from the kind of implied connotations from how raw eggs were featured within the Rocky franchise. And I think specifically Rocky 1. So with that in mind, do you suspect raw egg consumption to be better or worse or equivalent when compared to cooked eggs, specifically in terms of like muscle protein synthesis and building muscle?
Yeah, so now that I'm a little older and know more things, I would assume that raw eggs are probably worse than cooked eggs, just because like most I think proteins in general, certainly animal proteins, as far as I'm aware, have higher oral bioavailability after cooking, just because like the cooking process kind of unravels some of those proteins, makes them a little bit easier to digest. And I believe that's particularly true of egg protein. So I would anticipate that cooked is better than raw.
So I am going to, in this segment, cover a new study that actually directly compared raw versus cooked egg consumption, specifically looking at acute muscle protein synthesis after a resistance training stimulus. So very straightforward study. But before we get into that, I want to take a little detour and talk about protein quality. It's something I've talked about previously on the show, but not since we had all these additional capabilities with adding visuals and graphics and things like that. So I wanted to give a nice little concise overview of protein quality, why it matters, and then circle back and talk about that study. So first of all, protein quality is, you know, there are several different scales that are typically used to quantify it. And academics like to argue over which scales were best. And of course, it changes over time as people win arguments and create new scales and then have more arguments and win those arguments. So if you look back at older research, you'll see, and current research, depending on the application, people talking about protein efficiency ratio, biological value, net protein utilization, protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. I mean, there's a long list of these different metrics that people use to basically say, not just which protein's better than another, but give me a number so that I can really start ranking, you know, large lists of different proteins. And the general idea behind protein quality is like, to what extent can a human being consume this and really efficiently and effectively utilize the proteins within the food for building new human proteins? Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about fitness stuff, we're almost always talking about building new muscle proteins, right? That's really what people are interested in.
Yeah.
So you might be wondering why this matters. You know, an egg is an egg, so you'd be thinking, well, these both have the same protein quality. But actually, as you alluded to, raw versus cooked eggs, you know, they have the same amino acid breakdown or profile. That's one huge component that goes into protein quality, is what amino acids are in this and in what relative magnitudes. Mm-hmm. But it's not just the amino acid profile, it's also the digestibility. And like you mentioned, many proteins, their digestibility is influenced by the way that they're processed or cooked. And eggs are no exception. There was a study by Evenepoel and colleagues back in 1998. And I'm going to put a little table on the screen here. But what we're looking at is the true ileal digestibility. And what's really fascinating is you might think, okay, cooking a protein, maybe it takes it from like 85% digestibility up to like 92, right? In the case of this study, they found that percentage of true ileal digestibility went up from 51% to 91% by cooking it. So we're talking about a very considerable difference in this particular metric of protein digestibility. So with this in mind, someone might very justifiably assume a cooked egg, same amino acid profile, but way better digestibility. Surely this is going to promote muscle protein synthesis to a greater extent than raw eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, very justifiably, they would say, well, if it builds muscle better over 5 hours, literally building new muscle protein, surely that means it's going to build more muscle over 5 weeks or 5 years, right? So we have this tendency to say, well, if it's better for muscle protein synthesis in the short term, surely it's better for hypertrophy in the long term. So that brings me to this new study, head-to-head raw versus cooked eggs. And this was by, do you know how to pronounce that last name?
I don't.
Fuchs. I have no idea. It's probably a German last name, if I had to guess the origin.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm Googling it real quick.
Yeah. So anyway, this study, which actually referenced Rocky Balboa in the title.
All right. Are you ready? I've got it pulled up on YouTube.
Okay.
I'm gonna crank the volume.
Fuchs. All right.
There we go.
Hopefully we don't get like a copyright claim for throwing that audio in.
I apologize, voxifier.com. We didn't mean to steal your intellectual property.
So Fuchs. Yeah, that makes sense. And it always makes sense in hindsight when you look up how to pronounce something, but you're like, yeah, that was one of the 35 ways I would have tried.
Yeah.
So anyway, Fuchs and colleagues, like I was mentioning, they specifically mentioned Rocky Balboa in the title, which I thought was kind of clever. But very straightforward study. After a resistance training session, they gave these protein treatments, right? So one group of people got cooked egg, the other group got raw egg, and then a third group was like a control group. And if memory serves, I think they got a lovely croissant with butter and a little bit of orange juice.
Nice.
So it was a much lower amount of protein. It was like 5 grams of protein. The other treatments, going based on memory, I think they ended up getting I think it was 5 eggs each. And so that puts you in like the 20 to 30-ish range for protein.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a pretty standard protein dose for someone who's trying to get a really nice, robust protein synthesis response. So what they were looking at here is looking at plasma amino acid responses. So just after ingestion, how did key amino acid levels change over the course of the next few hours? So when we talk about key amino acids, there's a few we want to mention. So leucine is a very special amino acid in the sense that it plays a role in actually stimulating the response of muscle protein synthesis. It plays more of like a signaling role of telling the muscle, hey, plenty of leucine here, let's go ahead and start building muscle, right? And so the leucine is really important for triggering that response. And then the essential amino acids are critical because we need all of them to be there and present in sufficient amounts so that we can build new muscle proteins. So when you look at these amino acid responses, it's very common to say, okay, what does the leucine look like? Are we getting a big increase, a really rapid peak, and a sustained high level of leucine? And then same thing goes with essential amino acids. Are we getting a really nice, robust response with a really big increase in blood levels? Now, I'm going to show on the screen here, the amino acid responses were very in line with what you would expect, right? So looking at blood levels of leucine, there was not a large increase at all looking at the control group which had that really low protein meal. The raw egg group did have a noticeable increase.
It looks like plasma leucine went down in the control group if I'm looking at the right figure.
Yeah, I should have put the actual time amount on the x-axis there. I think that just has to do with the preceding resistance training stimulus and how that impacts those acute dynamics. But yeah, the raw egg, there was a noticeable increase, a significant increase statistically speaking. But the cooked egg had a significantly greater increase in blood leucine than the raw egg. So that would go in line with the assumption, right? You cook it, the digestibility goes up. We have a better, more robust leucine response compared to raw eggs. Now, if we look at total essential amino acids in the blood, it was the same exact pattern. So the control group, it actually dropped off a little bit and there was a little reduction. The raw egg did have an increase, but the cooked eggs had an even greater increase. So based on the blood amino acid levels, you would say this is going exactly as how I would expect, and surely we're going to have a better protein synthesis response in the cooked egg group because of that better amino acid response in the blood.
Yeah, so far this is exactly what I predicted. So let's just wrap this segment up and
yeah, that would be nice. Unfortunately, there's a complicating factor here.
Oh
no. You're going to see on the screen here, we're looking now at muscle protein synthesis rates. And what they did was they looked at kind of baseline, and then they looked at the first 2 hours after ingestion, and then from hours 2 to 5. And in the first 2 hours, all three groups had a significant increase. But then when you look at hours 2 to 5, you start to see a bit of a divergence there, right? So when you look at hours 2 to 5, you see that clearly, statistical comparisons aside, we see a more robust increase in muscle protein synthesis when we're looking at the raw and the boiled eggs compared to the control group. But when we start to compare the raw and the boiled eggs, they look extremely similar. I mean, they are virtually identical when you're looking at protein synthesis rates, whether you're looking at baseline 0 to 2 hours or 2 to 5 hours. And then once again, they also included a figure there where they were looking at just overall that whole 0 to 5 hour time period after ingestion. Again, baseline, all groups are pretty similar. Looking at that entire 5 hour period, all groups did have an increase in protein synthesis rates. But when you look at the actual magnitude of the increase, once again, the raw eggs and the boiled eggs were very, very similar. And in fact, looking at that 0 to 5 hour, when it's all collapsed together, the raw egg bar is slightly higher, not meaningful whatsoever from a physiological perspective, but whatever advantage we would expect from the boiled eggs having a better, immediate response in terms of amino acid levels, it simply did not translate to muscle protein synthesis. So there was a favorable effect if you just look at the blood amino acid kinetics and responses. But for muscle protein synthesis, there was really no influence of cooking when compared to the raw eggs. So this comes to a broader point about protein. There is a chain of assumptions that a lot of people make, and the assumptions build on each other, right? And so the chain goes like this. We look at these individual protein sources one by one. You'll often see people saying, should I have whey or casein or milk or egg or chicken or beef, whatever? A lot of times we'll look at these things in a vacuum and say, well, first I'm going to look at quality, which is based on amino acid composition and digestibility. And I'm going to assume that better quality or higher quality score leads to a better amino acid response in the blood. And that necessarily leads to a better muscle protein synthesis response acutely. And that necessarily leads to a better hypertrophy response over time. It helps me build more muscle over time. And a lot of times, without explicitly stating it, a lot of people do assume, have a tendency to assume that those relationships are like perfectly correlated and also related in magnitude in a very direct way. So a lot of times people assume if I have a 5% better, protein quality score, I'm going to have a 5% better response in blood amino acid levels and a 5% better muscle protein synthesis response and a 5% better increase in muscle over time. And what's really important to recognize is if that kind of chain of assumptions held true, there would be things we would expect to see in the literature that we should be able to expect pretty reliably, So we should expect that the studies looking at acute muscle protein synthesis responses with all these different acute feeding protocols of this protein versus that protein, they should give us a very clear, reliable, and predictable pattern of which protein sources lead to more protein synthesis. There should also be pretty clear relationships by which animal-based protein sources very obviously and routinely outperform plant-based protein sources whether we're looking at protein synthesis or long-term changes in muscle over time.
Yeah.
We should see, as an extension of that, that vegan and vegetarian diets do very, very poorly in studies compared to omnivorous diets when we look at these outcomes of protein synthesis and hypertrophy over time. And really, even among omnivorous diets, if this chain of assumptions held true with the type of high correlation that some people expect, we should even expect that people who eat a higher percentage of animal-based proteins on an omnivorous diet should have even better results than someone who says, maybe I'm going to go kind of plant-based and only get like 20% of my protein from animal-based proteins, right? So even within an omnivorous diet, we should see that a general preference toward more higher quality animal-based protein should win out in the long run. And one thing that's important, I talked a little bit about animal versus plant-based protein sources. The reason that I group them and kind of categorize them as lower versus higher quality, that's not a hard rule. There are low-quality animal-based proteins. So like collagen, its amino acid profile, if you're trying to build muscle, is just rubbish. It's terrible. And the studies bear that out. It is not a good muscle-building supplement. When we look at soy, that's a very high-quality plant-based protein. But overall, plant-based protein sources tend to have lower quality scores. What I'm going to show you is a series of figures from a study by Van Vliet and colleagues. And what we see, it's a bunch of different protein sources, plant and animal-based and human. That's just to give a representative example. That is not implying you should be eating human muscle. I would discourage that in the strongest terms possible.
Yeah, I mean, because it has considerably less leucine than whey. So
exactly.
Yet another reason to not eat humans.
There's literally multiple reasons.
Yeah, there at least two.
Yeah. So, but when you look at these plant-based proteins, generally speaking, they have lower leucine per gram of protein. Generally speaking, they also have lower essential amino acid levels per gram of protein. Although I do think it's worth pointing out that there is considerable variability among animal-based protein sources, right? So I find it a little bit ironic that people will say like, oh, I don't eat plant-based proteins or I don't rely on them because they're such low quality. But you never see those people splitting hairs between like whey and egg or whey and beef, right? They just consider it all to be high-quality protein. But there is still considerable variation there.
I see on these lists that for leucine content and amino acid content, cod is particularly low down on the list as far as animal proteins go, which might make you feel a little bit silly about trying to replace me with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
Is he a big cod guy?
If memory serves, he's a huge cod head.
Wow.
Which that might make you question some of his choices.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that. I'm still waiting for him to get back to me, which is strange because I sent that email 3 years ago, but we'll see. Now, I'm also going to show a figure here of lysine and methionine. And the reason that this is important is because a lot of what we would call low quality proteins, one of the main factors kind of dictating, if we're going to just split into a dichotomy, high versus low quality, like we can give them a graded score and all that stuff. But one of the issues with a low quality protein is, generally speaking, per the definition, it's going to be lacking at least one essential amino acid. Of all the essential amino acids, there's going to be at least one where it's really falling short in a way that inhibits its ability to support muscle building to a maximal extent. And the two most common ones that we have to keep an eye out for are lysine and methionine. And we're going to come back to that a little bit when I talk about practical applications of plant-based proteins. But we can definitely see that for a lot of plant-based proteins, they fall a little bit short with either lysine or methionine, whereas animal-based proteins tend to have plenty of both. So that's a key distinction between them. But when we look at digestibility, when we look at essential amino acids, leucine in aggregate, animal-based proteins tend to have better looking metrics than plant-based proteins. And so, like I said, with that kind of chain of assumptions, you would assume, well, surely plant-based proteins are going to fall way short when we look at the literature for protein synthesis and hypertrophy, but that's really not the case. So there are a couple meta-analyses in the last couple of years, one by Morgan and colleagues, one by Lim and colleagues, and generally speaking, they found that, one of them was looking at specifically plant versus animal-based. The other was looking at high versus lower quality proteins. So like, for example, I think there were some studies in there that used collagen as the low quality protein, even though it's animal-based.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, when you look at acute muscle protein synthesis, the data generally lean in favor of looking better for these higher quality protein sources and these animal-based protein sources. But there's some mixed evidence there. I covered it in a Mass article a year or two back, where there's actually a surprising amount of contradictions in some of those head-to-head comparisons. But nonetheless, overall, broadly speaking, generally the research indicates that muscle protein synthesis acutely is better for these higher quality proteins, especially when there's no resistance training involved. And that's important because resistance training itself provides a very robust stimulus for muscle protein synthesis, leucine and amino acids aside.
Yeah, I mean, even going back to the study that, like the main one about eggs that we're talking about here, I mean, it looks like just the resistance training stimulus itself increased muscle protein synthesis like threefold over baseline, and resistance training plus either version of egg consumption maybe increased muscle protein synthesis fourfold over baseline. Yeah. So like the impact of training itself was considerably larger than protein.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Training and having a lovely croissant with some butter and orange juice, those people were in a good spot in terms of protein synthesis there. The extra protein from egg just elevated it a little bit beyond that. So generally speaking, like I said, better acute muscle protein synthesis findings for these higher quality proteins. But when you introduce a resistance training stimulus, that starts to muddy the waters a little bit. And then when you make the leap and you stop looking at protein synthesis and you instead look at things like hypertrophy or strength development over time, those differences really fade away. And I'm not going to get into all the nuance and detail of why that's the case, but I am going to refer interested individuals to a paper by Wittard and colleagues called Making Sense of Muscle Protein Synthesis, a focus on muscle growth during resistance training. The entire premise of that paper, or at least the way I read it, was to explore why in that chain of assumptions, things do break down along the way, and why we cannot look at a protein and make a perfect assumption of how it's going to impact muscle protein synthesis. And even if we could, protein synthesis, those acute studies really do not predict long-term hypertrophy nearly as well as we would hope that they do. So a lot of people will say you need to eat this protein source because it does way better in these acute studies on protein synthesis. And those findings, generally speaking, do not pan out particularly well for long-term hypertrophy within certain contexts.
That reminds me a lot of like EMG research. Like you go back 5-6 years, there were a lot of well-meaning and generally well-informed people who, and like, not throwing shade, I was one of them, who would make like pretty strong recommendations about like, oh, you should do this exercise instead of this other exercise to grow this muscle group. Because look, like we see higher EMG responses with exercise A versus exercise B. And, like over time, we've learned more like, that's not really a validated assumption. And there are a lot of situations where that assumption, like higher EMG leads to more effective training stimulus, more muscle growth, where that assumption breaks down. And now I think a lot of people are pretty wise to that, but I don't think that same level of, I guess skepticism is an okay word for it, has really reached protein synthesis or protein quality data quite yet.
Yeah. And to be fair, I mean, a lot of this research is really developing before our eyes. A lot of the research I'm talking about here, the meta-analyses, the two studies I'm about to mention, These are all from the last 2 years or so, right? So two studies that really put this to the test, and I think were really eye-opening studies for a lot of folks who had a tendency to really micromanage the minutia pertaining to their protein sources. One was by Montaigne and colleagues. And what they did was they looked at two diets. One was vegan, the other was omnivorous. Both provided 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day, which would be within what we consider kind of the optimal kind of general range. And what they looked at was muscle protein synthesis levels, not acutely after a single meal, but longer term, over 3 days with resistance training included in that protocol. And what they found was if you're eating plenty of protein, and these diets were supplemented with a pretty decent amount of mycoprotein, which is a pretty high quality plant. Well, it's a fungi-based protein. They used to say it was mushroom-based, but then they got hit. They ran into some litigation because people were like, this clearly is not a mushroom. And they're like, right, but no one wants to eat fungus. But yeah, mycoprotein is a fungus-based protein source that fits within vegan diets and has a pretty solid set of characteristics for protein quality. But generally speaking, 1.8 grams per kilogram per day over this 3-day period. Both groups, whether it was vegan or omnivorous, had similar muscle protein synthesis rates over those 3 days. So that gives us more information than looking at a single meal, but still, it's protein synthesis. It's not hypertrophy. But that was covered shortly thereafter in a study by Javier Lorraine and colleagues. They were looking at 1.6 grams per kilogram per day in a diet that did have a significant amount of soy protein rather than mycoprotein. Soy, again, a really nice plant-based protein with some really favorable characteristics. So I'm not indicating that protein quality is fully irrelevant, and that's an important thing. These diets had some mycoprotein, some soy, some other kind of conventional food products that have plant-based protein. So I'm not saying protein quality is irrelevant. Just have collagen and you'll be fine. That is, of course, an indefensible statement. What my general argument is getting toward is we want to just have a mixture of pretty okay proteins, and that seems to be just as good as micromanaging and saying, well, what if I increase the protein score from 87 to 92, right? The effect of that is 0, right? So I'll get to those practical applications as we go, but since I highlighted mycoprotein and soy as being pretty high quality proteins, it is relevant to mention, but we'll put all those pieces together in a moment. But in this case, again, eating enough protein, 1.6, not a super high amount, right? So back in the day, a lot of folks would say, well, you can do fine on a vegan diet, but you have to eat a way, way, way more protein than an omnivore. Mm-hmm. This study directly contradicted that and found that over a very, kind of standard resistance training study timeline, longitudinal study in conjunction with resistance training, whether you were on a vegan diet or an omnivorous diet, both groups had very similar improvements in strength and hypertrophy. So like I was saying, my main premise here is not that protein quality is irrelevant. That's an indefensible statement, but it's that we need to change the way we view that kind of chain of assumptions. And I think we need to work backwards. So the goal here is to support maximal or near maximal hypertrophy responses to training, right? And if we work back, it's not that we need to start with protein quality score and build up from there, but we need to work backwards and say, in order to get this great hypertrophy response, I need to find proteins that give me a good enough muscle protein synthesis response. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be the best one when we compare head to head. I need my muscle protein synthesis response to this protein to simply be good enough.
Yeah.
And how do I get there? I need to make sure that I have a blood amino acid response that isn't way better than all the other comparators. It just has to be good enough to get me there.
Yeah.
And how do I get that good blood amino acid response? I just need the amino acid composition and the digestibility of that protein source, once again, to simply be good enough. Mm-hmm. So these little, tiny, minute differences comparing one to the other, they don't seem to be that informative. What we need to do is make sure that at each step of this chain along the way, we need to have protein sources that are simply good enough to get the job done which lends itself to the question, how good is good enough? Like, how do we go about sorting through different protein sources within kind of a conventional diet, not looking into like hyper specialized protein sources or anything like that? And, it's frankly extremely easy to find protein sources that are more than sufficient to support hypertrophy to essentially to a near maximal level. So what we're trying to do here is, over the course of a full day, make sure you don't have any glaring shortcomings when it comes to essential amino acid coverage. So like I said, some proteins are going to be short on lysine or methionine. You want to make sure you don't have any massive oversights there. You also want to make sure that you are selecting and preparing food sources in a manner that simply conforms to basic preparation guidelines. You want to cook things the way they're supposed to be cooked. But generally speaking, if like when we're talking about these studies with like the soy study, the mycoprotein study, I didn't see anything in the methods. I could have missed it. I didn't see anything where they were saying, oh, by the way, we also were extremely meticulous about arranging the other protein sources in the diet. It was just like, hey, you're on a vegan diet. Let me guess, you're going to be eating wheat and rice and corn and beans and whatever, right? Like the other protein is just coming in from just eating foods that find their way into kind of standard typical diets.
Mm-hmm.
Now that leads me to a question, Greg. So the overall goal here, like I said, no massive shortcomings for essential amino acids, and just eating stuff in a preparation method that is advisable, and making sure that you're not having any stomach discomfort due to poor digestibility. A lot of omnivores start to, go in line with that original chain of assumptions and say, oh crap, I need to make sure that I have all of the highest quality protein sources. A lot of people don't realize, like, they'll make like protein oats and be like, well, I put in 24 grams of whey protein, so this meal had 24 grams of protein. It's not the case. Oats have protein, and usually more than people think.
Yeah.
So usually omnivores who are into lifting will make that realization and say, oh my God, a considerable portion of my diet is crappy proteins.
I mean, I've seen people even put forth the idea that, like, the 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day or whatever, that's specifically just for high quality animal protein.
Yeah.
Like you should be aiming to get that much animal protein in per day, not just total.
Which that
is directly counter to the research.
Well, I was going to say, I don't want to be an asshole, but like that range of numbers comes from a study.
Yeah.
You can just look at the study and say, is that what these numbers mean?
Correct. Yeah.
And they don't.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. Back to being nice and charitable. So some people will say, like, crap, I need to really tighten this up and stop counting all my lower quality plant-based proteins and only count my high quality ones from animal sources. So, Greg, what % of daily protein in an omnivorous diet comes from plants rather than animals, if you had to guess?
Oh, man. So this isn't my guess now, because we've talked about this off mic before. But before we talked about it off mic, just kind of like based on my assumptions about my own consumption habits before I started tracking, I would have guessed that about maybe 3/4 of the protein in an omnivorous diet comes from animal sources.
Animal sources.
So about 1/4 from plant sources.
Yeah. So when I started digging into this research, my assumption was that the percentage coming from animal-based proteins was much higher than it actually is. And I think a lot of that comes down to demographics that inform those assumptions. So I'm going to put a table on the screen here that talks about the breakdown of animal versus plant-based proteins in a diet. Now, the worldwide average for an omnivorous diet is 42% of protein from animal sources and 58% from plant sources. That's a much higher contribution from plant sources than I would have expected. But then when you start to break down things based on socioeconomic status, and you break things down into regional localizations, you start to see that there are very clear patterns. So, like, for example, in the Americas, we have a pretty, decently high percentage of our protein coming from animal-based sources, whereas when you look at Africa and Asia, for example, there are lower percentages coming from animal-based protein sources. So part of that is regional. It also breaks down a little bit differently as you go from lower income to higher income categorizations. But yeah, the take home there is that, in fact, a decent percentage of protein in an omnivorous diet across regions does tend to come from plant-based proteins, and that's fine. Because when you look at even a small contribution from animal-based proteins, you are still getting plenty, more than enough of leucine and essential amino acids, lysine, methionine, the whole deal. So if you're on an omnivorous diet that isn't like 90% plant-based, you really don't have to put a lot of effort into scoping out these meticulously curated lists of protein sources. But that brings me to a vegan diet. And I've mentioned on the show, my diet is getting closer and closer to vegan as the years go on. It's strictly vegetarian, but kind of flexible with dairy and egg. But a lot of people say, well, I'm a vegan, so I can't really lean on that assurance that I have some animal-based protein coming into the diet. So what do I do here, right? So sometimes vegans who are into lifting will think, man, this sucks. I'm going to have to look into like this huge list of like 9 essential amino acids for every single protein source and really carefully kind of fit this puzzle together. And fortunately, that's not the case. Practically speaking, when you look at plant-based protein sources, we can categorize them in a very convenient and efficient way. So a lot of the common plant-based protein sources we'll see in the diet can be categorized based on the particular essential amino acid that they are coming up short on. So I'm going to put a graphic on the screen that's from bodybuilding.com. I understand that, food selection is regional. So these categories aren't going to be perfectly representative of every region of the world. But this was looking at stuff that you might find in these are all food sources I would expect to see in an American supermarket walking down the aisles. But there's a group of proteins that are missing threonine and lysine. And so we're talking about oats, rice, pasta, rye, wheat, corn. There's a different group where you're missing methionine, so beans, lentils, peanuts, chickpeas, peas, and soybeans. There's also a category where you're specifically missing lysine. So that would be walnuts, cashews, sesame seeds, sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, a bunch of seeds and nuts, basically. So what's really convenient about this is when you categorize protein sources, basically all you're trying to do to meet your needs for amino acids is just make sure that you're not picking all your proteins from one of these groups, right? Mm-hmm. You want to have what they call complementary protein sources, which basically means if all of your protein sources that you're currently going to seem to be missing methionine, so if you're just like hanging out totally in group B, just try to work in some protein from group C, right? And so what you're trying to do is mix and match these groups a little bit, and it doesn't have to be perfectly done. It doesn't mean you have to have 50% of your protein from group B and 50% from group C or something like that. What it means is you just want to have a mixture from multiple groups that are making up your daily protein intake. And as long as you're doing that and you're meeting basic general recommendations for protein intake, everything else seems to sort itself out just fine. So those general recommendations, which are important based on the literature, you want to make sure that you're getting at least 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of total body weight per day. Or if you do a little bit of math, that generally breaks down in most cases to aiming for at least 2 grams of protein per kilogram of fat-free mass per day.
That's for if you're like approximately trying to maximize muscle growth, right?
Yes, if you are trying to
maximize,
go
lower than that.
Absolutely, yeah. This is for optimizing hypertrophy. This is not for supporting general health. Yeah. General health, basically, you'd cut these in half, right? Yeah, usually you'd go 0.8 grams per kilogram. Mm-hmm. Is that how it goes? I think that's
yeah.
The fitness industry has so aggressively shit on the RDA for protein that I've basically forgotten what it is.
Yeah,
but yeah. So
I'm pretty sure it's 0.8.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, so those are the targets you want to shoot for. Again, if you're trying to maximize hypertrophy, you're lifting. You also want to split that protein, ideally, if you can, into like 3 to 6 servings per day. How important that is subject to debate. A lot of what we know about those specific protein distributions, a lot of it's based on, acute studies that lack ecological validity. Some of it's based on studies that don't involve a resistance training component, which, like I said, provides not just a large, but also a long-lasting stimulus for protein synthesis. But if you're interested in optimization, it shouldn't be too terribly difficult to break your protein into somewhere between 3 to 6 servings per day. If you say, listen, I got to do it all in one meal, that's fine. Based on the literature, it doesn't seem to be optimal, but you can still go a very, very long way with that strategy in terms of hypertrophy. And then again, you just want to make sure that there are no glaring lacks of any particular essential amino acid. And all that requires is making sure that you're not literally getting all of your protein from a particular group, like we mentioned previously with those complementary protein categories. You just want to make sure you've got some proteins that have plenty of methionine, some that have plenty of lysine. Generally speaking, threonine it's important, but you don't have to work as hard to make sure you've got it covered. Usually you're going to have enough to get the job done. Mm-hmm. So I think that covers a huge percentage of questions and concerns related to protein intake. And again, the general take-home point here is it's probably not beneficial to get too bogged down in the details about micromanaging really, small differences in specific protein sources. What you're trying to do is hit those general recommendations, have a nice mixture of proteins in your diet. You should be good to go. 2 caveats I want to mention, like you alluded to, this entire segment was basically assuming that you lift weights and that you're interested in maximizing hypertrophy. So that's an important caveat or kind of clarification to add on there. This is not like a segment about general health guidance. Another caveat, there might be situations where an individual is restricted to a low protein diet for medical reasons. Not my place to say what those reasons should be. If you're working with a qualified healthcare professional and they need you on a low protein diet, they'll let you know, not me on YouTube. But in that scenario, if you're like, okay, I am restricted to a lower protein diet, but I have an interest for a variety of reasons in getting as much strength and lean mass as I can, that is a specific scenario where I do think protein quality could become a more pertinent issue, because what you're trying to do there is basically get more bang for your buck and focus on protein efficiency. So what is the smallest total grams of protein I can ingest while getting maximal benefit for supporting hypertrophy and strength gains? And almost certainly, if you've got a qualified healthcare professional telling you to restrict protein, you're going to be well below the intake that meets those general recommendations I gave for lifters. So in that case, that very specific kind of unique situation, I do believe it makes sense to then prioritize higher quality proteins. It doesn't mean a protein score of 94 is totally different than 91, but you will probably want to prioritize just so that you can try to get all your bases covered with leucine and essential amino acids without having to take in, 1.6 grams per kilogram per day.